This week, we are continuing our series called My Big Mouth. We've been in this series for 3 weeks. If you were not here over the last couple weeks, you surely missed out, but you are not lost, I promise. We've been dealing with our struggle with our mouth and the way that we talk and the things that come out of our mouth. In week 1, we talked about criticism and that critical mentality that gets us into trouble a lot. Last week, we talked about honesty and integrity and really how to deal with life when we're the product of broken promises. Today, we're talking about something that I believe every single one of us deal with. Okay, as a preacher, you run into these topics that you're like, okay, this is for the most of them, but it might not hit everybody. Even though everything in Scripture is good, it's sometimes difficult to hear things, on marriage when you're not married or whatever else. Today, I believe, is something that every single one of us deal with. If you get through the end of today and you're like, I don't deal with that at all, please come talk to me afterwards. I would love to download your secrets because I know that I deal with this. But today we're talking about this personality, I guess, of complaining. The complaining person, okay? All of us deal with our big mouth in the area of complaining. We struggle with it. One of my favorite parts, or one of my favorite things in this series so far, is learning or researching some of the statistics that come along with each topic. We talked about some of the statistics in criticism and our honesty and how much we lie. I did some research on complaining this week, okay? It's really interesting. You ready? So the average person complains for 8 minutes and 45 seconds a day, okay? 8 minutes and 45 seconds a day. What that means is that you complain for 54 hours a year. Okay, that's over 2 days of complaining straight through. That's like red light complaining. That's 21 items in the express lane complaining. Hey, thanks, buddy. That is, what else do we do? It snows, it rains too much in Washington, right? How many times have we said that? I think that I'm at like 6.5 minutes already today, and it's 10:30. We deal with this. We're bad at it. Okay, they say that we complain 1,300 times a year. Major complaints, things that run across our mind. Let me show you how. So, for those of you who are social media illiterate, I want to explain something to you that happens on the internet, okay? And maybe some of you are internet experts. Just bear with me for just a few minutes. But there's this thing that happens on social media called a hashtag. Do we know hashtags? Okay? So something happens on social media, and so you write your statement, and then you kind of punctuate it with a hashtag. A hashtag kind of sums everything up, or it expresses your main thought. For instance, you wake up on a Sunday morning, you drive to church, you get to church, you snap a picture, you post it on Instagram. I'm so glad it's Sunday, headed to church, can't wait to hear Pastor Ryan preach today. Hashtag Timberlake, hashtag good looking preacher. Whatever you might post to kind of emphasize what you're doing or what matters most in your day, right? It's a hashtag. A few years ago, there was a hashtag that was created called First World Problems. Have you heard of it before? What it did is it created this forum for people to start complaining about their first world problems. Okay, not the third world stuff, the first world. And what it did is it was silly and kind of ridiculous, but it referenced what we complain about in comparison to what maybe the rest of the world complains about or less fortunate countries complain about. So I pulled a few of them. Can I share a few? Okay. Number 1. I'm on the last 30 pages of Game of Thrones, but my book ran out of batteries. No, I pulled that off the internet, right? First world problems. We complain about stuff like that. Number 2, I dislike the fact that I forgot to change that slide. This is what it's supposed to say. I dislike the fact that my trip to my family's second home involves a 6-hour airplane ride to a different continent. A simple cottage getaway would be nice. How many times have we complained about our second home being too far away, right? Let's bring it back stateside. Actual internet complaints. Just had my praline spread confiscated by TSA at Dulles. As far as I'm concerned, the terrorists have now won. First world problems, right? Number 4. I know this is a total whine. These are not mine, by the way. I pulled these from the internet. I know this is a total whine, but there is so much leg room in business class that I can barely reach the touchscreen TV. Life is hard, folks. Number 5. Had to wake up for the ironing lady to come and collect my clothes, and she still isn't here. How many times do we get annoyed that the people who do our laundry have not showed up? Right? Or number 6 is my favorite one. A swan just spat in our salsa. First world problems. Come on, if you're in a position where a swan is spitting in your salsa, you have traveled outside of the realm of complaining, and we no longer care about you. We tend to complain about ridiculous things. And rarely do we even recognize it. And really, I think that mentality of complaining is something that becomes habitual to us. We do it and we don't recognize that we're doing it. We don't notice it anymore because we've become so accustomed to what we say. Truth be told, this morning, like I said, I'm getting text and, I'm throwing up, I can't come, and I'm thinking, oh, man, and then it's snowing, right? And I'm thinking, there is nothing worse to a preacher on Sundays than snow, right? And it's snowing, and it's really, really snowing. And I'm thinking, man, this is terrible. And I'm driving down the street, and it clicks in my head as I start to tell Shayna about this morning, man, you're playing a part in what you're talking about. Actually, what I think I said to Shayna is, I think that I've said, this sucks 12 times. Okay, it was 6:30 a.m. We become so accustomed to it that we don't notice it. It's almost surprising what we complain about. And if we do an inventory of just one of our days, and we compile all the things that we've complained about, we would probably be embarrassed to tell somebody about it. We'd probably be embarrassed for somebody to know what we've complained about. The other day on I wake up every morning and I have like a notification on Facebook that tells me my memories, right? Year after year, it adds up all these memories from, on this day over the last years, whatever. So I wake up to this one. It was a quote from myself. It said this: sometimes I love it. 8 years ago, I was hilarious. But this was the quote from literally 8 years ago. It says, why is it so hot? No one should ever have to feel the kind of hot I'm experiencing. This is the worst hot ever. I felt that was Facebook worthy when I posted it on Facebook. And we lived in Florida, and Florida is a miserable state to live in. But I felt that bad grammar and all, I felt that was relevant, and the people of the Facebook world needed to know how hot I was. And I'm friends with some of you on Facebook, and I know that you do much worse than that. We feel like we have a right to complain because certain things, of course, have legitimate obstacles, and they validate the complaint. Health reasons, financial reasons, financial setbacks. Maybe you're going through a divorce. Maybe you're a single parent. Maybe you're a student struggling to get through school. I know that I have faced some of the greatest trials in my short life that I could ever possibly imagine facing. And sometimes it feels really, really good to complain because those trials are just part of life. And sometimes it feels good to get out there and say, man, it is just so hot. And I say all that to say, or to ensure that when I'm talking about complaining over the next few minutes, you recognize the fact that I'm not minimizing your situation. I don't want to minimize the pain or the hurt. I know that some of you are facing the biggest storms that you've ever faced. Some of you are walking through some of the biggest trials that you have ever walked through. And we can have fun for a minute, and we can talk about our vacation home being too far away. bringing it back stateside. But the reality is we all have problems that eventually flip our world upside down. In the New Testament, Paul writes a letter. And it's a letter that I think can help us in this area. But before I read this passage out of one of Paul's letter, I want to give some context, because a lot of times what happens when we're facing situations, we're facing trials, is whoever is speaking to us, we don't necessarily give credit to because they've not walked through what we walked through. We don't necessarily listen to them because they've not experienced what we experience. How can I glean any insight from this person because they don't know the struggle, right? So here's Paul writing in this passage, and it's kind of a resume almost for Paul's trouble. It says this in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. It says, "Are they servants of Christ? Am I out of my mind to talk like this? I am more. I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1, which is how many? 39? Some of you are struggling on that. Jesus had the 40 lashes minus 1 right before his death. They worked up a system, and once you hit 40 is pretty much the cutoff point, and they kill you at that point. So they would stop at 39. Jesus got the 39 lashes right before his crucifixion. Paul got it 5 times. It says 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger of false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst, and I have gone without food. I've been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily pressure of my concern for all the churches." Can we look at it? And we first thought last summer we moved to Washington, and it was like 100 degrees outside, and we have air conditioning in our house, right? It's the same story. Paul got 39 lashes, and we're kind of whining about air conditioning. 3 times he was beaten with sticks. He's been shipwrecked. He's been floating out in sea by himself for a day and a night. We can't compare. And on top of that, he still faces the pressure of the concern for the church. This is still Pastor Paul at this point. And on top of facing beating after beating and jailing after jailing, he's stressed about the church. I don't know, maybe you've been in prison, maybe you haven't, I don't know. But Paul wasn't in prison for shoplifting or too many speeding tickets. Paul was in prison for pursuing God. Paul was in prison for preaching the gospel. And Paul surely wasn't getting his master's degree while he's in prison, right? This is a bad situation for him. While doing the right thing, bad things happen. And if anyone has a reason to complain, it's Paul. It's this guy. If anybody has a reason to say anything negative at all, it's this guy. But Paul wasn't complaining when he lists off these things that he's struggling with. Paul is maybe outlining why he's about to say what he's about to say. He writes another letter to the church in Philippi. And he's writing this letter as encouragement to the church. If you are a believer, if you are a Christian, if you have Christ in your heart, this letter is pointed directly at us. It says this in Philippians chapter 2. It says, "Do everything without complaining and arguing, so that no one can criticize you. Live clean, innocent lives as children of God, shining like bright lights in a world full of crooked and perverse people. Hold firmly to the word of life. Then, on the day of Christ's return, I will be proud that I did not run the race in vain, and that my work was not useless." So Paul writes this letter, and he starts it off, do everything without complaining. everything you do, don't complain. But then he goes on to tell you why he's saying it. He gives a reason why not to complain. He says, do everything without complaining so that no one can criticize you. Do everything without complaining because they're watching you. Remember, this letter is directed to the church. This letter is directed to the believer. It's directed at us. And he's saying, don't complain because they're watching you. They'll criticize you. People are paying attention to you. And what separates the believer and the unbeliever is our hope in Christ. We all go through valleys, whether you're a Christian, atheist, or radical Islam. We all walk through these valleys. What separates us is how we walk through them. As believers, we walk through them with Christ. Some of us choose to walk through our valleys with our heads held high. And some of us walk through our valleys limping, gasping out in pain as loud as we can, looking around, ensuring that somebody is looking at me. Am I being too harsh? Can I say that today? It's like this if you've ever been around a kid before. If you have kids, the other day I was watching my 4-year-old Scout take her shoe and her sock off to show some extremely random person where she had dropped something on her toe earlier that day, right? And I'm like, put your sock back on. It was one of those kind of things. If you have kids, you've probably experienced the fact that kids want you to be aware of their pain, right? My mom and Shayna and the kids all make fun of me because growing up and still today, I like to check my body to ensure that I don't have any boo-boos on them, right? Like, I have no issue telling Shayna about the mosquito bite on my calf. It's one of those kind of things. We like people to be aware that we are in pain. Kids love the attention. And of course, as parents, we become privy to it. Our youngest daughter, she's like 1 or something. She's crying the other day, right? I'm in the kitchen. I've been with her all day. I kind of don't care at this point because I'd been alone with her all day and she'd been kind of just a fussy kid, right? And so I'm making her a grilled cheese, and I hear her fall over. She's kind of learning to walk, and she falls over, and I look over, and she's crying, and she's angry at her cup. She's holding a cup. She's pointing at her cup because her cup is what did it, right? And of course, we become privy to their need for attention. So I just look at her and say, "Are you okay?" She's 1. She doesn't know what I'm talking about. She's pointing at her cup. So I go back to flipping grilled cheeses, right? I'm the best at a grilled cheese. So I'm making this grilled cheese, and I look over, and she's still crying. She's still pointing at her cup. So I go over to her, and I pick her up. And the minute I pick her up, it's like I squeezed her too hard, and blood just starts pouring out her nose. And not just like a little, like it's a weird amount of blood, and it's dripping on her shirt. And so I pick her up, and I dust her off, and I tell her my story about valleys and how we walk, and I send her on her way, right? No, of course, I'm like, this always happens to me. And I clean her up and whatever else. But in the same way that we control how we criticize, in the same way we control our honesty and our integrity, we control the way that we complain. We control the way that we handle our trials. It's what separates us from others. And the way that we walk through our trial is part of our witness. The way you walk through your trial will always draw attention from people. It will always draw attention from people. The difference is one way draws criticism while the other draws question. I want my life to be a life that draws question. I want somebody to look at my trial and say, man, how can he be so cool in that situation? That somebody looks through it and says, man, how can he handle this situation that I have gone through as well, but so much better than me? I want my life and the way that I draw attention to bring question, not criticism. Paul's telling us that our lives are to be a testimony to others. So do everything without complaining. So how do we do it? How do we practically live it out? Here's your key idea in your notes if you have them. Exchange complaining for changing. We have to exchange complaining for changing. Take your complaints and swap them out for an active means of change. And here's how we do it. Number one, we change our circumstance. Change your circumstance with the understanding that there are circumstances in our life that we don't get to change. There are circumstances that we don't have control over. What can we change? Instead of complaining about them, we need to figure out how to fix them, how to change them. I heard someone say it like this once: don't complain about what you have control over. If a swan is spitting in your food, stand up and walk inside. Don't complain about the things you have control over. Make a change. If there are things that we can change, change them. And maybe there are certain things that we can't change, but there are plenty of things that we can. I got to a place a while back where I realized that in my job, in my work, I would sit in a staff meeting and I would identify a problem, but I didn't have a solution. So I started to shut my mouth. Because a statement without a solution is called a complaint. So rather than throw out my problem or my complaint without a solution, I just stopped talking. And I'm not always good about it, but I want to be a person who comments with solutions. It's so hot in here. I think I'll turn up the air condition, right? Like that kind of thing. Have a solution for our complaint. And a lot of times, we feel like that we don't need to have a solution because our effort goes unnoticed, or maybe our solution isn't the right answer. So rather than provide solution, we just complain. But we need to learn to exchange things for changing, and part of that is changing our circumstances. I heard an exchange the other day on the internet. A man walks up to a woman and he says, "Hi, how are you?" She looks back at him and she says, "Can't complain. How about you?" We've probably said that before. And the guy looks back at her and he says, "Yeah, I can't complain either, but I still do." And then there's like a laugh and a chuckle for dad jokes, right? But we do the same thing. We might not be able to change everything in our world, but we can take the steps in our personal life to move in that direction. We only have control over ourselves, so we need to exchange your complaint for change your circumstance. Again, the problem with this is that we don't always have the ability to change the circumstance. There are some things that are inevitable and we can't get around and we can't correct the issue, so what we do is number two, we change our perspective. When you can't change your circumstance, you change your perspective. There are things that we can't change, but what we can do is see them differently. What we can do is view them differently. I think that all of us can look back at our life and make a very, very long list of things that we're unable to change. Life-altering things. I'm not talking about cars that broke down. I'm not talking about bank accounts that have been overdrawn. I'm talking about things that we have zero control over. As a lot of you guys know, last summer I had brain surgery, right? And when we moved out here, I was still in like the thick of recovery. So I have this brain surgery. They tell me and about it that I have to have, and of course I freak out. Anytime somebody wants to cut into any part of you, you panic, right? If I have to get a shot, I panic. And somebody's telling me, okay, we're going to open your head and do some surgery. So I start to panic, and then I realize, okay, I need to look at things differently. This will fix the problem that I'm having. So I let them go through it. The effect of the surgery was this temporary paralysis of literally half of my head. Okay, some of you are here at the beginning of my time at this church, and you might remember, and maybe some of you still see some of those effects. It knocked out half of my head, like the whole thing. Like half my tongue doesn't work, half my nose doesn't work, that kind of thing. It was miserable. Okay, I come out of this surgery. It was the worst thing that I could possibly imagine. I spent 2 weeks in just the bottom of the barrel. And then we move here, and I start this new job or at this church, being at this place. And what I had to do, and what I had to learn in all of this, because this recovery process is like an 18, 24-month process. What I had to do is change my perspective and change how I viewed it. So what I did is I found a list of worship songs that played a part in how God controls everything. And I started to let God pour into me that way, and my perspective on something that I had zero control over changed. It was really, really difficult to get past. And as Shayna can probably attest to, I whined a lot. A lot. I still whine a lot about it. But when we realize that God is in control, we change our perspective when we look at things differently. When there's no way around these things, we have to begin to see them differently. Don't hear me wrong. There are times where we need to talk about things. There's a time for best friends. There's a time for counselors. There's a time for pastors. There's a time for moms, right? Anybody go to their mom? No, I don't. I'm a man. See, when we begin to change our perspective, opportunity begins to present itself. This is what I was thinking along those lines this week. When we moved out here last summer, we came down to interview. We flew out here from St. Louis to interview, and we fly into Seattle, and we drive down here to come to church that first morning, and we get off the exit over here on I-5, and the first sign you see when you're coming into Castle Rock, it says, actually you can show that sign for me. It says Castle Rock, population 2,135. And I'm like, oh, crap. There was a lot of prayer and discussion that day. Because I'm thinking, how in the world can we come into this town, this tiny, tiny town of 2,000 people, and build a church? And then, of course, God got a hold of me. And I realized that day that it doesn't say Castle Rock population 2,135. It says Castle Rock opportunity 2,135. And here's the thing about it. I drive past that sign every single day, sometimes 3 times. And they say that when a billboard is up too long, it becomes part of the scenery. So you have to change your billboard or people stop seeing your advertisement. Yeah, in the last 8 months, I've yet to stop seeing that sign. Every single day I pull into Castle Rock and I see a sign that says there's an opportunity for 2,135 people. Not including all the surrounding areas that you all travel from, of course. But I want to be a person that looks at my struggle as an opportunity. It can be viewed as a challenge, or it can be viewed as an opportunity. So the question when it comes to this is, how do we become people that reach the 2,100 people? How do we be the people that reach those people that are not waking up on a Sunday morning and driving to church? Rather than view it as an obstacle for us, we start to ask ourselves, how are we serving our city? In the book of Matthew, Jesus is having a discussion with his disciples. And as Matthew writes this part of his gospel, he starts it out by identifying the location that they're having this dinner. They're in this town called Caesarea Philippi. That city is noted 2 times in the New Testament. And I think that Matthew notes the town because he's showing a contrast with the people he's sitting with in the way that the town is. This town, Caesarea Philippi, is a bad town. It's very, very well known for its pagan worship. Okay, they were not God lovers. So you've got Jesus, the Son of God, and then the guys that are closest to Jesus, the Son of God, and they're sitting in just a bad place. And they're having dinner. And Jesus looks at him, and he says, "Who do people say that I am?" Peter replies back to him in Matthew chapter 16. He says, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. They say that you're just a man. You might be a good man like John the Baptist or Elijah or one of the prophets. You're a good man, but you are just a man." It goes on, "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied back, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound on heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Jesus looks at him, and he says, who do the people say that I am? Well, they said that you're a good man, but who do you say I am? And then Jesus looks at him, and he says, man, everything I have is yours. When we begin to view our dilemma and we look at everything through a lens of Christ, it presents itself and say, man, God presents himself and says, man, this is an opportunity for you. The dilemma is an opportunity for you. The trial is an opportunity for you. The struggle, the stress, the frustration is an opportunity for you. This is simply one example, but we have the ability to control the way we react in the valley. But while in the valley, there's a good chance that God is attempting to do something with you. God is attempting to do something through you. God is attempting to use you the way that you were intended to be used. When we complain, we start to edify the problem. We start to validate our problem. And what we have to understand is what we do follows who we are. And what I mean by that is that it's almost like we complain our problem into reality. And it begins to shape our day, and it begins to shape our life. The way our workday is carried out is how our morning started negatively. And ultimately, it says that my problem is so much bigger than God's reach. Our first reaction is to jump on Facebook and let the world know. And every time somebody hits like or throws out a comment your way, it's like they're throwing another validation log on the fire. What if before we complain, we look at our problem through what God can do in it? Regardless of the problem, regardless of the storm, regardless of the circumstances, God doesn't change. Paul goes on in Philippians chapter 2, but I will rejoice even if I lose my life, pouring it out like a liquid offering to God, just like your faithful service is an offering to God. We can't always change our circumstances, but we can change our perspective. I'll close with this last verse in 2 Corinthians. Paul is writing his second letter to the church in Corinth, and he's talking about a thorn in his side. He references a thorn in his side. Something is happening in Paul's life that is negative. He's walking through this valley, this storm, this trial, and he refers to it as a thorn in his side. And there's debate all over the place of what that thorn is. We don't really know. But it goes on to say this in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. It says, 3 times I begged the Lord to take it away. Each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I'm glad to boast about my weakness, so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weakness, and in insults, and hardships, persecution, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Another notable translation, maybe you've heard it this way, is my grace is sufficient. That word sufficient is funny because we don't throw it around very often. Not because it holds a lot of weight, but because it kind of doesn't hold a lot of weight. If your wife makes you a beautiful dinner, candlelit dinner, and it's wonderful, and at the end of it, she looks at you and she says, how was dinner? And you look in her eyes and you say, it was sufficient. It's not going to go that well, right? It was sufficient. We don't use that word a lot because the word generally doesn't boast of excitement. So why in the world is God saying my grace is sufficient? When you look into that word sufficient, it means the perfect amount to get the job done. My grace is sufficient. Obviously it doesn't apply to your wife because, of course, yes, my belly is full. You've done your job. But when we're talking about grace, it says my grace is enough. It's the perfect amount to get the job done. My grace is sufficient. It's exactly what you need. Whatever you're going through, I'll give you just the right amount to get through it. Paul says, I have a thorn in my side. And 3 times he goes to God, God, I have a thorn in my side. And God is, hey, hang in there. My grace is sufficient. This is Paul. This is Jesus' best friend. And yet Paul is still going back to him and saying, God, but I've got this thorn in my side. My grace is sufficient. All right. God, I've got this thorn in my side. It's still there. And God says, my grace is sufficient. Paul, I'm going to give you the perfect amount of grace to get through your situation.